That's good. I was hoping the organisers would be showing the slides because, as I say, I'm working from my iPad. Well, thank you very much for that invitation, and thank you for the organisers for giving me the opportunity to talk about a subject which I've been working on for over 30 years. So you will excuse if I'm having to condense this into a rather short talk. I'm going to have to go through fairly quickly. So what I would like to cover, obviously, are the challenges in fighting food fraud, which exist of defining food fraud. What is food fraud? Identifying the risks of food fraud occurring, developing the appropriate authenticity methods to detect food fraud, and then accessing intelligence and available information sources. And I'll talk about the network which I am currently working with. So what is food fraud? Well, there are a lot of definitions out in the literature and in other documents as well. There is a new CEN Technical Committee on Food Authenticity, which has a working group looking at the definition. Codex Committee on Food Import and Export Inspection also is defining food fraud. But at the moment, especially in Europe anyway, and that includes the UK, there is no legal definition of food fraud. The network did a project recently in collating all the definitions in the literature and in other advisory documents, and I picked out two here, which I will not read out, but basically all the definitions on food fraud contain the expressions that they are deliberate deception for economic gain, and so this is the sort of common theme that runs through all of them. I particularly like these two because they cover the whole food chain. But you can read, if you want to, the full report on those definitions on the Food Authenticity Network website. When I was working in government, we used to work to these types of fraud, and this, I think, is a fairly comprehensive list of food frauds. First of all, there's subsidy fraud. This is to do with the customs classification and perhaps the World Trade Organization definitions, but more dealing with local food fraud. It's avoiding hygiene and quality requirements. That is recycling byproducts which are unfit for human consumption and then putting them in the food chain. There's illegal slaughter, often from rustled animals that are stolen. There's illegal animal product imports. Changing health marks is quite a common way of fraud occurring, and also durability dates on products. More commonly, food fraud is adulteration, which is the addition of ingredients which are not normally present in the food, such as water, starch, sugars, melamine in the milk powder, in a rather large fraud that took place in China, using industrial alcohol to make up drinks, and also not giving the correct quantitative ingredient declaration. Then we have substitution, which is replacing ingredients by cheaper ones, and there's a lot of examples of these. Also, that includes counterfeit drinks, mainly spirits, but also soft drinks as well. And then we have origin mislabeling, which includes not only geographic origin, but production origin, such as things which have been previously frozen but not labeled as such, GMOs, which are not labeled. And then we have irradiated foods, which again not labeled, and also certain systems of production, such as organic, fair trade, halal, and kosher. All of these types of food fraud, apart from the subsidy one, are because of contraventions of certain food legislation. And I'd like to think of food fraud when I was in government, of it being deliberate contravention of food legislation. So here I've listed quite comprehensively all the legislation and standards mainly concerning Europe and the UK. So we have the food labelling, which is now called the information for consumers, where you have to give the name of the food, which is often a legal name, which is protected, the ingredients list, the quantitative ingredient declaration, how much of in the name of the food, how much of that ingredient is present. There's country of origin labelling, and also net weight indication, where you might give incorrect drained weight or incorrect weight net of ice glaze. And then we have some legislation which is on specific foods, which I call food standards. This is vertical legislation on certain types of food. And in fact, in Europe, there was a large group of foods, often called the breakfast directives, because it was mainly the foods that were eaten at breakfast, such as chocolate, fruit juice, honey, jam, sugars, etc. And there you define what food is, and if there are ingredients in it, what the minimum fruit content, for example, in jam, what the minimum cocoa solids content is in cocoa, etc. And then you have marketing regulations, which often have certain compositional requirements or processing requirements. There are hygiene regulations, again, which often have certain limits of fat, connective tissue for meat, and also these waste products define what the waste products are, and certain types of feeding regimes, such as corn-fed or free range, are part of these hygiene regulations sometimes, or the marketing regulations. And then we have the general food law, which talks about fraudulent practices and the contravention of those. The fact that there is no legal definition does not mean that it's not possible to prosecute for food fraud. And what has happened in the UK is that you prosecute under these specific food legislations, and then we have a general requirement in our Food Safety Act, and I think it's also in the general food law as well, that if you're selling food which is not of the nature, substance, or quality, then that is guilty of an offence. So you can prosecute people both on the individual food law and then on this requirement in the Food Safety Act, which has a much higher fine, and is much worse than often the fines that are associated with some of the other food legislation. So often I'm asked which are the most adulterate, which are the foods which are most involved with food fraud. And I have to thank Food Chain ID, Karen Everstein, for these two diagrams, which show the food fraud records, which come from both media reports as well as government reports, official reports, where you can see the top 7 foods. Other includes things like ready meals, which is a mixture of ingredients, and nuts and additives. So they're a sort of non-defined group. But but next comes seafood, which is often mislabeled. The species are mislabeled, or more added water is added to it. And you have dairy products, meat and poultry products, herbs and spices, again, is quite problematic, and alcoholic beverages and honey, again, which is also quite problematic in terms of food fraud. The diagram on the right-hand side shows just in 1 year, last year, with just over 100 records, that it changes from year to year depending on how much investigation has been done. So going on to actually how do we deal with food fraud? Well, there are two essential components. One is intelligence, knowing what to actually investigate. And I'll talk about the sources of intelligence that are available, but also you need the tools to fight, to detect food fraud. And this is what we term food forensics. And it's called food forensics because basically they're the same techniques that are used in criminal forensics, but applied to food. So talking about these, first of all, it's quite challenging in developing authenticity methods. Usually the method is linked to a legal requirement, as I've discussed already. And so there's need to take some sort of interpretation into account. Often these involve tolerances and action limits. Secondly, you need to find a marker that characterizes the food or the adulterants in question or its processing. And that again can be quite challenging. And therefore there are analytical uncertainties of the markers and there are natural variation of the markers, which all have to be taken into account in developing the method and interpreting the results of the method. And then something which I found particularly difficult sometimes when I was working in government on the program to develop methods, and that is getting authentic samples to set up a database or to validate the method, especially if these authentic samples come from outside of the UK. They're often difficult to get hold of. But getting authentic samples is specifically important in situ instruments, which have to be calibrated to authentic samples to be able to show when the food has got is not of the right, doesn't conform to the composition of the authentic samples. Right, so in terms of the methods developed, then the DNA methods are something which have been developing very quickly. I started developing DNA in the 90s, and it's moved on very rapidly since then. There's extensive development of new methods using real-time PCR, and they're based on the fact that each species or each variety of plants has some unique sequence of base pairs in their genome, and these rely on detecting these unique sequences. So you have real-time PCR, you have single nucleotide polymorphisms, restrictive fragment length polymorphisms, and simple sequence length polymorphisms, all of which have been used quite extensively. But now it's becoming more popular whole genome sequencing because this can be done so much more rapidly. Next generation sequencing, and also even using CRISPR for editing the DNA or the genes. And I won't go into it, but there's a list of all the requirements when you're looking at DNA, the pitfalls that can occur. And at the bottom are a list of applications which I specifically have used, which again, quite useful. Second group of methodology is based on stable isotope ratios. Each element usually has a small amount of heavier isotope, and you are looking at the change in this ratio. And the ratio changes looking at rain and groundwater, which will vary from the distance from the sea when you get evaporation and then rain occurring. You have biological isotopes such as carbon 12-13, which depend on the biosynthetic pathway, the way they absorb CO2 and add it to the components. You have nitrogen, which depends on soil fertilization. You have sulfur, which often depends on distance from the sea. And then you're using geological isotopes, mainly strontium, which again defines that often in the soils that the plants are grown on, or the animals are feeding on. But basically, you have to set up databases of these isotopic ratios to be able to detect whether something comes from that origin. So it's quite easy to verify if something comes from that origin, but it's much more difficult if you get an unknown to say where that comes from. The third group are the omics, which are now becoming very popular. So omics, again, proteomics are using the same unique, as you are in the same unique sequences in the DNA, but then they're expressed as proteins and amino acids. So you break these down with trypsin, and you find specific unique peptides, which you can identify varieties, you can identify species. And metabolomics is then using the metabolites, often using NMR to screen a whole range of compounds. And again, you're finding changes in metabolites that's occurring either because of the way they're grown or the way they're processed. But I've just put this slide up. I'm sorry it doesn't show up that well on the iPad, but I'm just showing here that in fact you can use quite simple methods to discover certain types of protein, certain types of fraud. For example, you can use microscopy for often botanical origin of honey, also the use of mechanical recovered meat, you detect by microscopy, triglyceride analysis. You can't see too well, but the release of a HADH enzyme will tell you about whether a food's been previously frozen or not. And then it's becoming very popular now to have handheld instruments, on-site instruments based on NIR, FTIR, and UV. So moving to the other essential component, and that is identifying the risk and intelligence. And I found that the best way of identifying the risk is to have surveys of things. And often the surveys I carried out were as a result of intelligence I received from the industry, because often the food industry are the best place to know whether something is being sold at a price which really is too good to be true. This slide shows, unfortunately, that we had many types of surveillance programs going on, which have all been virtually stopped now, and it's unfortunate. Unfortunately, this doesn't show up on my iPad. It will show up on the presentation I sent to the organisers, but it shows the surveys that were carried out up to about 2009 in the Food Standards Agency, and it was quite extensive. Today we have, at least we have some surveillance and coordinated enforcement going on, and I'm showing here Operation Opson, which has got to number 9. It's carried out every couple of years, and 9 was more on a global scale as well as just in Europe. And you can see the results. I put the link to the report box on 9, where you can see what was carried out. An extensive number of prosecutions took place and food taken off the market. So in terms of the UK, in terms of obtaining information, I've made a list of the things where people can turn to get intelligence. First is the Food Industry Intelligence Network, FIN, which I'll mention just now. RASFA is the EU Rapid Alert System, and where fraud has safety implications, then you can get the information from that. You've got now the National Food Crime Unit in the Food Standards Agency and the Scottish Food Crime Incidents Unit in Food Safety Scotland. There's a European Food Fraud Network. The European Commission's Joint Research Centre in Giel has a knowledge centre for food fraud and quality, and then something that I've been working on for the last 7 years, the Food Authenticity Network. So I'll just mention these in passing. Now, the Food Industry Intelligence Network was set up again after the horse meat incident, and basically it's a membership of over 50 UK companies, both large and medium companies. And what they do is they pool all the food authenticity analyses that they carry out on a quarterly basis. These are presented to analysis, which can show up trends where things are going wrong or things are happening. And they also liaise with government so that they can communicate with government if they're finding that there are problems. The FSA's National Food Crime Unit again was set up after the horse meat incident in 2013, and this works with the local authorities and collates the work that they're doing. It has a whistleblower facility. It issues newsletters, annual reports, and it does carry out some investigation. The European Commission's Food Fraud Network, unfortunately the UK now is outside of this, but there is then rapid exchange of information between EU countries where food fraud is occurring, so that the other countries can take action if it's necessary. And they again have annual reports which you can access online. The JRC, I mentioned, also does some method development, and they offer certain services for food fraud when countries carry out coordinated investigations. It does publish a monthly fraud summary, which you can find on our website, but you can also sign up for it to be sent individually. Again, it has analytical services and networking with EU risk assessment agencies. So finally, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the network, which I've been working, as I say, I've been working on. And this again was set up by the government after the horse meat incident, where there was a report by Professor Chris Elliott, who said there should be a resilient network of laboratories, so that there isn't the same mistakes that took place when a lot of samples were analysed in the horse meat incident, which perhaps weren't done in validated methodology. The network is financed by a public-private management, which means we get government money, but we also get money from private sponsors, companies, and other ones, including the Food Industry Information Network. And this allows us then to offer free membership to people who want to join the network. The network, I've got the network has a website, which you can see is foodauthenticity.global, and those are on the right-hand side are all the things that you can find. There's methodology, there is food fraud mitigation information, there is, and then we have news items which talks about fraud incidents or new methodology which is being developed. And this is the advantage of being a member, is that you get a monthly summary of these, and you also get newsletters. Our membership is over 3,300 now, from 93 countries. The top 3 groups of members are from the food industry, food analysts, and food regulators. So that's a very important group of people. You can see they come from all over the world now, and we have quite a lot of people in members in Europe that are quite active. And we cover most of the world, I think, there. So although we have 3,300 members, we have something like nearly 34,500 unique users of the website. Not all the users are members, but they use the facilities of the website from 165 countries, which is an increase of 60% from 2020, and this is increasing the whole time. Finally, this is just to show you perhaps the mitigation tools that are available on the website. And you can see there's a whole list of mitigation guides, which you can you can have access to on that. There's also methodology which has been developed under the Food Authenticity Program, which I worked on, and we're hoping that eventually we'll be able to. Okay.
Не знаешь, вообще-то я вроде бы не очень.
So that's the end of my presentation, and happy to take any questions. And you can see this is my local market in Kingston upon Thames. Thank you.